Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. In 1925, the perception of Christianity was forever changed. In what now seems like an instant, Christians went from being respected religious leaders to being ridiculed for their beliefs. The perception is clear. Christians can't defend their faith. Many questions were asked in the infamous Scopes trial, but one question stands out above the rest. Where did Cain get his wife? It would seem to me that the answer is fairly simple. Genesis 5:4 states that Adam had other sons and daughters. And considering that Adam lived over 900 years, I believe it is a safe assumption that he had many sons and many daughters. So where did Cain get his wife? Simple, from one of the many daughters that Adam had before he died. We have to remember, it was neither a moral issue nor a biological issue back then. There was no law that prohibited this back then, and there was no concern for negative biological consequences given the near-perfect state of nature at the time. So why are people so baffled when they read about Cain's wife? I believe it's due to a simple misinterpretation of the text that preceded. There are many things we must take into account when one reads the Bible. For example, it is a mistake to assume that the Bible is written in perfect order with a timeline starting at point A and ending at point Z. In the case of Genesis, for example, we see how the writer begins at the very beginning and progressively tells the story of creation from day 1 to day 7. But then we see how in the second chapter, the writer goes back to the creation of man, which occurred on the 6th day, retelling the story in more detail. The writer then proceeds to tell the story of the fall of man and continues progressively up until the death of Abel and the birth of Seth. But then in chapter 5, we see how the writer once again goes back in the timeline to give more detail about Adam's genealogy. With this in mind, we can now go back to the story of Cain's wife and see that we really don't know how much time passed between each event, and therefore must not assume that everything happened closely. In fact, it is clear that time had passed between Abel's death and when Cain found his wife, based on verse 4:14, which implies that Adam's many sons and daughters had already been born. It is important to note verses 16 and 17 of chapter 4, which do not state that Cain found his wife immediately after killing Abel, but rather that he had traveled to the land of Nod and knew his wife sometime after, implying that he already had his wife, possibly even before killing Abel. We are talking then about a period of about 100 possible years between the birth of Cain and the meeting of his wife. This is more than enough time for the land around Eden to have been populated by Adam's children. Note that there is no reason to believe that Cain, Abel, and Seth were the first and only children at the time, but rather they were merely the most significant for the purposes of the writer of Genesis, which is why they are mentioned by name. This is a common practice in biblical genealogies.